All right, hey guys, here it is, finally, my tracking video of the Reverb G2. Yeah, in my first impressions video, I discussed a bunch of different things about the headset, and I said, yes, I love the headset, but the tracking was the part that I criticized. Of course, it's very difficult, just to talk to you about tracking, and describe everything, but yeah, I'm gonna try to go in depth in this video. So the goal of this video is, first, I want to make sure we all are on the same page with understanding the tracking, and then I'm going to demonstrate tracking in a variety of scenarios so that you can draw your own conclusions. So that's my goal. I don't want you to rely on someone else's conclusions. I want you to make your own conclusions. In this video, I'm going to be explicitly showing when the tracking breaks, because I think if I show you a bunch of scenarios where the tracking works, I may or may not be doing a good job of describing when it's going to break for you. That's kind of the question, right? The tracking is going to break sometimes. There's always edge cases for any tracking system. There's always going to be edge cases. So I want to point out the edge cases, and then you can make your own conclusions as to whether or not that affects you. So we're going to start basic, and then we're going to work our way towards real examples. Just keep in mind for this video, I'm going to be intentionally breaking the tracking. It doesn't necessarily mean that the tracking's bad. It just means that I'm showing the limitations. So the first thing I want to talk about is the headset tracking. I didn't really cover this well in my first impressions video because I just didn't even think about it. Honestly, the headset tracking works great. It's like 100% fine. Don't worry about it. But I will explain how it's working. So, the 4 cameras here are looking out into the environment. They pick up areas of contrast or, objects. So, for example, like corners of table, couch, things on the wall, like contrast on the floor, anything. And it picks all that up. And then, when you move your head, it sees how all of those points move, and that's how it calculates the tracking. This means that this tracking will be sensitive to light, and so you need to have good contrast in order to get that good tracking. I was able to break the tracking one time by accident. I was using my green screen, actually, and I'll talk about that in a minute, too. I was facing the green screen like directly, very close to it, and so it started to lose tracking. I could see my environment sort of wobble and drift, so I looked left and right, and the tracking was fixed in like half a second. And it's only happened to me once, ever. So yeah, I think the tracking's totally fine. I think just like don't surround yourself with blank walls, and you'll be fine. And if you don't have enough stuff in your room, just throw something in the room to enable it to track. So yeah, now we get to the bulk of the video. The bulk of the video is about the controller tracking. Let's go over how it's working. What it does is it detects the constellation patterns on your controllers. So there's these lights that light up. It looks like this, right? There's the constellation pattern. It's not looking so great on camera because I have this extra light on, but again, the lighting matters. The camera needs to see this pattern in the environment in order to track the controllers. So yeah, it's looking at the constellation pattern. The distance between the dots and the distance around the ring determines how far away it is from the cameras. Then there's 2 other methods that the controllers use for tracking. One other method is with the gyroscopes in here. So the gyroscopes enable the controller to know its pitch and yaw, its like orientation in space like this. So if you lose tracking, then it'll still have its orientation detected. And then the final thing is the IMUs, or the accelerometers in here. I'm not sure if there's a difference, but inertial measurement units are used to do the tracking predictions when it's in motion. So if you do like a big swing or you're moving it really quickly, the accelerometers in here are using the tracking predictions to do it. And this also carries forward for going outside of the tracking volume. So if it knows the position of the controller at some point, and then it's able to use the accelerometer to track it all the way through, even outside the tracking volume, which makes sense. So that all being said, I come up to my, the green screen discussion again, because I know some people were really skeptical of my demonstration in my first impressions video that I used the green screen in. And I understand why. A typical green screen setup will have like studio lighting or whatever, like, a really nice green screen setup would have lots of extra lights. I have no extra lights. I'm literally just putting a green cloth on my wall, and I don't have any experience with the tracking being any different between when I use it with and without my green screen. So you can take my word for that. That was just purely a demonstration just to show you what I was talking about. It's important to keep in mind that as long as this constellation pattern is not being obstructed, which I think is based on lighting, not having a green cloth on my wall, then it's fine. So now we get into the tracking volume discussion. The cameras have some sort of field of view outside of them. They have blind spots, right? So this defines your tracking volume. It's the volume in which the controller will receive the absolute position data from the constellation pattern. And so in order to test the tracking volume, what I did was I moved the controllers very slowly from inside the tracking volume to outside the tracking volume. I'm gonna do this in a mixed reality setup so that you can see very explicitly exactly where the tracking's breaking. But again, if you're not convinced by that, I'll throw in a couple first-person points of view, but I really think the mixed reality view gives you the best impression of how the tracking is working. So I'm going to do this in Beat Saber. There's going to be my sabers on the controllers, and then when the sabers disconnect from the controllers, that's where the tracking volume is defined. Just keep in mind that the tracking volume on its own will not define how good the tracking is. I'm going to do comparisons with the Oculus Quest, because in my opinion it has a good tracking volume, and I have no issues with tracking on the Quest. So we'll see how the G2 compares to it, and then we'll talk about it. But anyway, for now, let's just take a look at the tracking volume. So yeah, that's the tracking volume clips that I took. I can tell you right off the bat that you'll notice that there was an upper limit that was like pretty obvious even within the first person view. But actually, I don't find much of an issue with that, surprisingly. The thing is, you don't usually put your arms above your head in VR. It actually happens kind of rarely, and when it does happen, you're usually moving, so the accelerometers will take over. See, that's something to keep in mind with these tracking volume videos, is like, you know, like I'll show you later how the predictive algorithms work. For the most part, over your head hasn't been an issue for me. People are also really bad at looking up. This is just a fun fact about humans, but humans are really bad at looking up. That's why like people hit their head on like doors and stuff, because you just don't look above your eye level very often. So when you do look up, you usually tilt your head a bit, and that'll help if the headset's up, then the tracking volume raises. You have to keep in mind also in these tests, I was keeping my eyes like dead on the horizon. So then the main issue to me, and spoiler alert for this whole video, the main issue for me for this whole thing is that bottom limit tracking volume in the front. Dang, that one does get used a lot. Anytime your hands are down at your sides, or you know, especially for me in like menus and stuff, I just find it very distracting that my controllers will lose tracking quite frequently. You know, then it's relying on the gyroscopes to just do the orientation of the controller. But in actual gameplay, it doesn't come up too much. At least not as much as you might expect, maybe. And, you know, I think the thing just that you kind of have to do with the G2, which is a little annoying, is, you know, you kind of have to just make sure your arms are just up a little bit more than normal. You know, you can't just like have them completely resting. You have to always have them a little bit flexed in your resting position, in your like default position. Another thing to point out too, you probably saw that the side tracking of the G2 is really wide. Actually, that's so awesome. The Quest actually doesn't have so great of that. So like I said, I think I really nailed it, honestly, in my first impressions video. I said that the Quest grenade throwing wasn't so great for me, and I said, oh, it's probably because I'm going outside the tracking volume somehow. And that looks like exactly it. I mean, you know, the Quest tracking volume ends right at the headset, you know, on the sides, whereas the G2 goes all the way back. So yeah, your throws in the G2 and all that kind of stuff ends up being very smooth for me. Pretty happy about that tracking aspect, actually. Otherwise, you know, those are all the tracking volume estimates, so you can make your own judgments on all of that too, you know, judge how it would affect your gameplay. For these next tests, what I wanted to do was test, I didn't know what to call it, but I called it the tracking recenter speed test. You know, if you're outside the tracking volume, how quickly does the headset realign your controllers if you bring them back into the tracking volume? And so you can imagine if that's really slow, that's horrible. So that's the main test for this. So I just did a really quick thing. I'm just going to show a couple clips here. But basically what you'll see is that between both the Oculus Quest and the HP Reverb G2, the tracking recenters pretty quickly. The times that I measured here were around 100 to 150 milliseconds, you know, give or take. I really just did a very rough estimation of when this controllers re-enter the tracking volume to how long it takes for them to be recentered. And also my webcam is 30 FPS. I can't really get super accurate timing. So, you know, it's just a rough test, and I just wanted to see if the G2 was significantly slower in terms of the tracking being recentered. But no, it seems to be right on par with the Oculus Quest. So there you go. So this is actually very closely tied with the tracking volume. You know, 100, 150 milliseconds, that's a non-negligible amount of time. You know, in a game like Pavlov or like a really fast-paced shooter, you're dead. If you're losing your tracking and then you're trying to pull up your gun and like it takes an extra even 200 milliseconds, you know, like that's enough time where, you know, that difference kind of does matter for like a competitive advantage, you know? So you'd have to make sure you keep your gun in the tracking volume when you're playing those types of games. So now we're going to get into some of the more realistic tests. I'm going to be doing a bunch of different motions that are commonly done in VR, doing it again in mixed reality. I want to point out once again that mixed reality footage is brutally honest. You know, if there's a tracking hiccup or anything in the mixed reality footage, you're going to see it. Whereas, you know, from my point of view, or like the first person point of view, you know, you won't see all of these little tiny tracking things. You know, it'll seem very smooth. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, now that we understand tracking volume and the tracking recenter speed, we can kind of try to think about how the accelerometers are playing a role in these upcoming tests. So I was going to do a cool little montage, but I figured maybe it's just easier if I talk over things. So, you know, taking a look at the clips here, you know, basically the story here is really just going to be quite simple, I think. It's just that the tracking prediction algorithms are actually very similar between these two headsets, I find. You know, I mean, you just kind of have to keep in mind what the tracking volumes are of each headset as I do these motions, but at the end of the day, all that really matters is how well they can do certain actions. For the most part, they do actions both very similarly. I think the G2 really benefits from the side volumes, which helps with throwing objects overhand and doing those swings that go way outside the tracking volume. And then also the grabbing objects from the belt was something that the G2 struggles more with than the Quest. The Quest tracking volume really covers the belt area a lot better than the G2. Again, you know, the G2's lower tracking volume limit really showing its face there. Another thing to point out is that the headsets both suffer from the same sort of problem with the behind-the-head tracking. You know, this is just true for like any inside-out tracking system. I think it's just a really hard case for it to analyze. But otherwise, I think my thoughts on this are just that both tracking predictions are very similar, given their tracking volumes. I think the tracking volumes that are underlying these motions are kind of determining how well they do certain things better than the other headset. And then we get to occlusion at the end here, and with occlusion, the Oculus Quest is crazy. I don't know how it does this, but it manages to track everything, even though my controllers are completely lined up. Whereas with the G2, it struggles a little more, but keep in mind that my controllers are perfectly lined up, and that's not super realistic for actual gameplay. So I find, like, you know, in actual gameplay, my controllers are really not gonna be perfectly lined up, I'm going to have a little bit of an offset because like usually the right hand is a little bit lower than the left hand when you're holding a weapon in VR. So yeah, just keep that in mind too. Another thing I wanted to mention real quick is actually a specific clip. So if you take a look at the picking up an object from the ground off to the side footage, you'll see that my left hand loses tracking on the G2 footage. So this is just, normally I wouldn't read too much into it, but this is kind of a quintessential G2 tracking moment, I would call it, where this really bizarre tracking behavior occurs despite the motion being seemingly simple. So I think my takeaway just from that little clip, and also just kind of my experiences with the G2 in general, is that if you have a little bit of a tracking hiccup, like let's say my left hand loses tracking while I'm playing a game, what I find is better than just, looking down and staring at your controller, trying to hope that the tracking comes back right away. If you move it, like if you get that accelerometer to have some data as well, then it'll immediately pick up that tracking back again. And so like that's why kind of the tracking speed tests are actually really fast. I mean, it doesn't feel like there's that much delay, the measurement that I took. Don't get too frustrated if there's like minor tracking thing, just shake your controller a little and move on, that's kind of my takeaway. But those type of tracking errors don't happen too often. It's just something that I wanted to point out because I think it's sort of an interesting tracking hiccup that can happen that I don't really get with my Quest. And again, I just really want to emphasize that that is a rare tracking hiccup. It's not typical, so it's just something that can happen. Now, moving forward, you guys are probably asking, tapping, like, you've shown us all of these different tests, but what about actually playing games? And you're right, that is all that matters, so I've got you covered. If you want to jump ahead to kind of final concluding thoughts and remarks, you can skip ahead in the video, but otherwise we're going to go ahead and get started with some of the individual big games, starting with Half-Life Alyx. Half-Life Alyx is an awesome VR game. If you don't know the game already, then I'm not sure how you found this video actually. So welcome, hello, I'm Tapping. I do VR and gaming videos. Follow me on Twitch. But in all seriousness, Half-Life Alyx is an amazing game, very well polished, and this is important for the tracking discussion because Valve put a lot of care into making this game very polished and work very well on any headset. So they've made sure that a lot of the motions and a lot of the actions that you do in the game are very well taken care of. Here you can see me, you saw me throw some grenades. That works beautifully on the G2. I mentioned that on my Quest I actually had some trouble throwing grenades overhand, and actually on the G2 it's been totally fine. Then also doing the puzzles in Half-Life Alyx, also totally fine, doing two controllers with your hands kind of going around each other. And, just doing the classic, shootouts. So, getting into combat and shooting the enemies. Something I was really impressed with was, even if I was whipping my head around and, like, doing a bunch of stuff, and even crouching on the floor, all the tracking held really well for me. So I really didn't have any major issues with Half-Life Alyx. It's not like a competitive shooter either, keep that in mind. Tracking issues really, really did not bother me at all on Half-Life Alyx, even if there were any. Half-Life Alyx, great experience, absolute pleasure in the G2. And I'm gonna have to replay Half-Life Alyx again just because it looks so good in the G2 and it's really, really fun, and I need to do that developer commentary run. For the next game, we have Boneworks. Boneworks is a very similar genre game, but I think this game pushes the tracking and limitations of the headset a lot more than Half-Life Alyx. Right off the bat, I can tell you the tracking for me was totally fine in Boneworks. So you can see the climbing I had no problems with. I was a little worried about that because of the upper and lower tracking volumes, but the tracking prediction algorithms worked great. And grabbing objects was fine. Swinging the sledgehammer, also totally fine. I think the side cameras really help with if you're doing larger swings, then the side cameras really help out there. And finally, using the weapons. So the weapons in Boneworks works differently than Half-Life Alyx. You can have weapons at your sides and or over your shoulders. So I found that the tracking for grabbing the weapons was totally fine. I can always get my hands into the right locations. The issue, however, I had was something I totally did not expect. The capacitive touch feature that is lacking on the controllers was inhibitive. So I would not normally talk about the capacitive touch feature as if it's just an aesthetic thing, but in this game, I found it affected the gameplay. In order to grab your weapons, your index finger needs to be bent. And on a normal capacitive touch controller, if you just rest your index finger on the trigger, then your index finger is bent. But on the G2 controller, you actually have to depress the trigger a little bit so that you get your index finger to bend. It took me a minute to figure this out, but basically, you know, initially I was just realizing, okay, I have to squeeze the trigger and the grip button at the same time to grab my weapons, which causes them to fire. If you partially depress the trigger, it works fine. But yeah, this is definitely a case where I think maybe some better controller bindings or maybe some community controller bindings will take care of this in a more elegant way. Another game to talk about is Population 1. So Population 1 is kind of the Fortnite of VR, and in this case it is a competitive shooter. You can see here that I'm able to climb the buildings just fine and also fly with my hands out to the side. Again, those side cameras really help with that. The competitive shooter aspect of this kind of starts showing some of the G2 limitations. Reloading the guns sometimes is a little finicky for me just because of the controller rings. That's not really a tracking issue. But for the most part, I was totally fine. I find myself usually holding my gun up. I didn't really find myself in weird positions where I had to regain tracking from my lower part of the tracking volume. I did have one hiccup in this game while I was trying it out, so I'll show that clip here.
Wait, where's my left hand? Oh, see?
Where's your left hand?
Yeah, no, there you go. I lost tracking, that's what happened.
Again, though, it's a pretty rare issue, but it was, a little frustrating, and certainly, in a competitive shooter, having some sort of tracking issue is disadvantageous. For Population 1, is the G2 an ideal headset? No, probably not. But does it work fine for me? Yeah, of course. I actually won both of the games with my friend when I was trying it out. It was a blast. Population 1, so fun, so fun. Now, on the topic of multiplayer shooters, we've got Pavlov, so this game's very fast-paced and pretty competitive. I'm not very good, so sorry if you have to watch my gameplay, but I had my friend over to use the G2, and he has 250 hours roughly in Pavlov, and he typically plays on a Valve Index. So I asked for his opinion on how the tracking worked for Pavlov. His first impression was that he didn't really like it too much. He was playing fine, he was doing really well, but he definitely, had these tracking hiccups happening a lot, and he was just kind of not finding it as smooth of an experience as his Index. But I watched him play, and as as we discussed tracking limitations, one of the main motions that was bothering him was he would hold his gun such that his right hand was right up to his chest, under his face, which is completely underneath the headset. And so, you're losing tracking every time you do that. Now, actually, a lot of the times when he was aiming like that, it was actually okay, because you aim, shoot, and then put the gun forward again. But, if you were aiming and then, turning side to side, that became a bit of an issue. So, after I told him about that, he started holding the controller, his right hand, a little further forward, just to make sure that it was in the tracking volume of the headset. And everything was working pretty well in that case. So for the most part, he was playing fine, but he did have to adjust his play style in order to play as well. He mentioned that some really good players in Pavlov actually use a gun stock, and we actually think that would completely remove the issue, because the gun stock would allow your controllers to always be in front of you, but you would still have that anchor point on your shoulder. Potentially you could use a virtual gun stock, so you can create a virtual anchor point on your shoulder as well, so that you have a third anchor point other than just your two controllers. So both of these, there's some players out there that swear by these methods, but me and him don't personally have experience with those two methods, but we believe that would help you have a similar experience on the G2. Again, very unfortunate that if you're coming from another headset, you may have to adjust your playstyle for the G2, in particular for this game. Now, moving away from a game that I'm not good at, let's move over to Beat Saber, where I've poured lots of hours into it. So, Beat Saber, I've already talked about it in my first impressions video, and I posted a couple Beat Saber videos, so if you haven't already checked those out, I would just recommend those. I'll just give the really long story short here, which is that, I can play beyond Expert Plus level. I was playing all the way up to the level I was playing at my Oculus Quest without any major tracking issues. There are occasionally tracking hiccups, So I don't think this isn't like the ideal headset for Beat Saber, but you can absolutely play this game, and you can play it to a pretty high level too. The main thing that's going to hold you back really is not going to be the tracking, it's going to be the controllers themselves. I think they're just a little bit on the bulkier and heavier side than I think is ideal for Beat Saber, but for the most part, Beat Saber plays totally fine. If it's just one of the many VR games that you want to play, you're going to have a blast playing Beat Saber. It's such a good game. Speaking of sabers, we've got a sword fighting game here, Iron Lights. Maybe this is a bit of a lesser known VR title, but I certainly consider it a hidden gem. Just as a quick rundown, the sword fighting mechanics in this game work such that you have to swing your swords. You can't just like wag them, like in some VR sword fighting scenarios you just wag your sword and hit things. So this game has really good mechanics and requires big sweeping motions. I found for this game that everything was running totally fine. I had absolutely no issues. I find that usually when you're holding your sword, you're holding it up. You don't have your hands relaxed when you're in a sword fight. The big motions are tracked really well. I think the side cameras play a really good role here. There's actually a bow and arrow mechanic in the game too, and the bow and arrow works perfectly, probably even better than my Quest. So yeah, everything was perfect in this game. Oh, and by the way, I should mention that I was running this game through Revive because I have this on my Oculus store. So I can confirm that running Revive in this headset is also amazing. It works really, really well. I honestly forgot that I was even using Revive when I played this game. And finally, we come to another game I was using Revive for, actually, which is 11 Table Tennis. I don't really have a whole lot to say here. Honestly, the tracking worked totally fine. The main thing I appreciated from the index was probably just the refresh rate of the headset for this game. I do think that seeing the ping pong ball move around quickly is benefited a lot from a higher refresh rate. But 90 Hz was totally fine, and tracking was completely fine. And I found, especially for like side swiping motions and overhead smashes, you don't want your overhead smash to miss because of a tracking issue. So I can confirm that, yeah, the side cameras on the G2 really help with those motions. So I had absolutely zero problems playing ping pong on this. I know I'm not an expert in this gameplay either, but I've played some ping pong in real life, so I just, if I can get used to the VR gameplay, then yeah, I think it's super realistic. And this game, yeah, super realistic game, really feels like you're playing ping pong and feels great on the G2. So that's the gameplay part of the video. So before we get into any conclusions, I just want to remind you that throughout this video, I've been intentionally breaking the tracking. Like even in my gameplay clips, right? I've been really highlighting tracking limitations and the most tracking intensive parts of games. Most of the time I'm playing games, I'm really not having any issues. So hopefully by this point in the video, you've already drawn your own conclusions. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you think this tracking is not adequate for me. I really don't want to deal with that. Some of you might be thinking, oh, this tracking is totally fine for me. I'll be happy to have a G2. That's great. As long as you understand what you need out of tracking and also understand what you're purchasing when you buy a G2, I think that's really the important part for you personally. Now, I guess some of you are probably wondering about my opinion. I think you already have an idea of what I'm going to say. I really do think the tracking is fine. My statements that I made in my first impressions video hold up here. The only thing that really bothers me is that lower tracking volume, but keeping that in mind, I really don't have any major issues at all. And I think that your playstyle might have to adapt a little bit to the G2, like especially if you're coming from another headset or like lighthouse tracking. I think just understanding the tracking limitations and how the tracking is working for the G2 is important for having a good experience with the G2. So hopefully this helps people not just purchase a G2, but also people who already own a G2 to help you better understand what exactly is happening with your tracking so that you can have a better experience. Another thing just to mention is that those tracking hiccups that I mentioned that aren't necessarily related to tracking volume or not, those may be addressable in software. I am hopeful that some of those issues will be resolved, but again, if you're questioning that aspect and you're planning to buy a G2, it might be wise if you wait a minute just to see more tracking videos and also keep an eye out for those software updates. The tracking can only improve from here, hopefully. So yeah, this tracking may or may not be a deal breaker for you. Now, if it is, there is a solution to this that still allows you to use your G2. And some of you might already know where I'm going with this. So for an extra roughly $600 US, might depend on your region, but you can get index controllers to pair with your Reverb G2. So this includes, you're going to have index controllers, base stations, and Steam controller tracking dongles so that you can pair the controllers to your PC. You need third-party software in order to link these things together. Now, I wouldn't be bringing this up unless I had personal experience with it. I want to tell you that yes, I have tried it myself and it works perfectly. So I had, my friend that came over brought his index, and so we were able to actually pair everything together and actually try it out ourselves. If you were like me and you're a little worried about spending $600 on some, hack that allows you to use index controllers with the G2, maybe you had some questions about it, such as the ones I had. So I was wondering, okay, is there any latency? The answer is no latency whatsoever. Well, how well does the calibration work? Like, are the controllers in the right spot, or are they like offset? And the answer to that is you can get the calibration perfect. The calibration, like by default, already gets you within like a few millimeters, and then you can just adjust manually the calibration to get it absolutely perfect. And so my friend and I both felt that the experience was equivalent to a native index experience. Another question you might have had about it, which I did too, how often do you have to do these calibrations? I've read really good things online about not having to do them very often. I can kind of attest to it, so I did shut down my computer and boot everything back up, and then found that the calibration held. Even if you lose your calibration, we at some point, I remember we did a recalibration. It took like literally 1 minute. The hardest part about it was grabbing my G2 controller. And it took us like 10 minutes to set it up the first time, from downloading software to getting everything running. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because, if tracking is the deal breaker for you for the G2, but your other option is really the index, and you are willing to go a little extra for the $1,200 setup, the G2 plus index controllers setup, then I can just vouch for you that it is really, really good, and your $600 isn't going towards some hack, it's going towards something that actually works really well. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for the video. I hope you found it helpful. So if you liked the video, give it a like. If you didn't like it, dislike it, and just let me know why so I can keep improving. Remember that most of my content is on Twitch. The link is in the description. Following me there is the best way to see more content and ask me questions live. Also, if you're wondering how this headset compares to typical Windows Mixed Reality headsets, I highly recommend checking out Clark Diggity's video on his Lenovo Explorer. And you can actually see that the HP headset, I think the front tracking volume is exactly similar to a typical WMR headset. Finally, I just want to remind you all that there's literally no perfect VR headset out there. Every headset has its own set of compromises. So just pick the headset that you think that you'll enjoy the most, and just enjoy VR. And you won't really go wrong here, all right? Like, all of these headsets, Index, G2, Oculus products, like they'll all give you a fantastic VR experience. Yeah, just don't go with the Vive Cosmos. Avoid that one. But otherwise, yeah, you really can't go wrong, and I think you're gonna enjoy VR no matter what. So yeah, that's it for the video. Take care.